All right, Unity of Fredericksburg, God bless you on this beautiful Sunday morning. Juan Enrique Toro here greeting you. I'm going to begin with a Bible reference today. Peace I leave with you, my peace I give unto you. Not as the world gives. I am one with you. Be not afraid. I begin there because I've been troubled, as many of us have, with the situations in the world today. Things like the Ukrainian war, of course, the mass shootings, Uvalde, Buffalo, only the latest. Saw a special on past shootings in the past. Plus all the sense of separation that we have in our political system. The attitudes towards this COVID situation. There seems to be any number of challenges that we are facing these days, and I found myself quite a bit overwhelmed with the negativity that surrounded me. So I wanted to share a message with you that can help us make sense of that. What can we do about it? How can we handle it? The spiritual solution is always the one that we are looking for. And so that's where we begin. Somewhere in the Bible, Paul says to us, grieve, but don't grieve as those without hope. And when he's saying that, he's saying there's actually two separate mistakes that we can make in the face of tragedy and death and suffering. On the one hand, we can try to avoid grief. We can try to avoid weeping. We can try to put it out of our mind to get past it, right? We harden our hearts. We only know that it'll only erupt later and devastate you. But there is another mistake. And the other mistake is to grieve without hope. In this Bible passage, Paul is telling us that there is a way for us, for the love of God, to inspire hope within us. And the way we have to do it is to love and grace need to be rubbed into our grief. The way we used to rub salt into meat in warm climates, or it'll go bad. Our grief is either going to make us bleaker and weaker, or it could make us more wise and good and tender, depending upon what you rub into it and what you put it in. And that's what we're here to do today. We're here today not just to feel our sadness and to weep, but to rub grace into our weeping with hope and love. There's a story, again in the Bible. John the Baptist was killed, cut down in the middle of his life, unjust attack. And two things happen. The disciples of Jesus gather up the body and they bury it. And they grieve over that death. And then they went and told Jesus. Now, we've all been bearing up, being tough with the situations. And some of us, unfortunately, have been focusing on burying the bodies, trying to bear under this incredible load that we're under. But the question we need to ask ourselves today is, symbolically, the disciples go to Jesus. Are we coming to God? Are we going to Spirit? Are we going to the heart for a deeper and more healing message? And that's why today I want to share this Bible story that you all know. It's the story of Lazarus, right? It comes from the book of John, 11:20 through 53. I'm going to read, I've edited out some parts that aren't relevant to us today. So if you read it in your Bible, it may sound a little different. But it goes something like this. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, while Mary stayed at home. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him." And Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." And Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." And Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they will die, will live, and everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? He answers with that question. She said to him, Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world. Now when Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, Where have you laid him? They said to him, Lord, come and see. And Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said, See how he loved him. But some of them said, Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? Then Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The dead man came out with his hands and feet bound in strips of cloth and his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to him, Unbind him and let him go. So, in this situation, Jesus brings four things that are very relevant to us today in the current climate that we're living. Truth, tears, anger, and grace. Truth, which he offers to Martha. Tears, which he shares with Mary. Anger at the tomb, and grace for everybody. So let's go through those, because it's something that I need, and it may be something that you need. But I'll go through it in a slightly different order than I've just mentioned it to it, so that it all can hang together for you. First of all, tears. What do we learn from the tears of Jesus? He cries after Mary came to him and asked him the question, a pretty tough theological question. And you know what? She says, Why weren't you here, Lord? If you had been here, he wouldn't have died. And Jesus is unable to answer her directly. He just weeps. And he says to her, Where have you laid him? That's the only thing that he can say. Now, he's weeping, he's troubled, he's moved. And, this passage has startled me for many years. And let me show you why it's so startling. Jesus moves into a situation like this. He comes in with two things that you and I might not have in a similar situation. The first thing, and he comes knowing why it happened. He knows the purpose of it. He knows that how this is going to turn out into a glorious manifestation for the glory of God. In fact, we can see earlier in the story that he might have even delayed a little bit in getting there after 4 days that he'd been already buried in the tomb. So he knew what he was all about. He knew the why, the purpose. He knew what he was going to do. And he knows that in just 10 minutes or so, right, they're all going to be rejoicing. And so he knows what's going to happen. He knows the purpose of it. And when you go into this tragic situation, we usually don't have that. We find ourselves asking, why has this happened? What's the meaning? What's the purpose? What's the deeper purpose? That's the first thing that he had. And the second thing, besides the truth about the situation, he had the power. He could do something about it. To go into these situations, sometimes we feel like we can't do anything. Or what we do is for naught, too little, too late, whatever. And so, we put ourselves in that situation. And it's very interesting that Jesus would weep. Now, if you were going to go into that situation, number one, knowing the purpose. Number two, you had the power to change it. In just 10 minutes, this thing's going to turn around. Would you weep? Would you weep? Would you cry? Why did you just walk on by and say, hey, watch this, kind of thing? And as you think about it, it does not make psychological sense. But here's the thing. The answer is that God is perfect love. Jesus is representing perfect love here. God is perfect love, and it is exactly what is needed at the moment. And wherever you may be, right? And whatever you need for that comfort is going to be available to you. Even for 10 minutes that Jesus was going to take and to resurrect Lazarus, God's love was present to soothe and to heal. Even if it's just for 10 minutes, God's heart does not close to us. So what do we learn from that? I think we can learn two things. One of them is kind of obvious, but I think it needs to be said. There's nothing wrong with weeping and weeping and weeping in a time like this when you feel like you're falling apart. There's a tendency in our idealistic philosophy that is unity to say that we know the truth and the truth will set you free. And we know that everybody needs to turn to God. But you know, Jesus is a very emotionally mature person. And he's falling into grief, even though he had those two things I mentioned. And so, here's what's important for us to remember. The best people will be the biggest weepers. Remind you, it's not a sign of weakness. In fact, better people are more like Jesus. If I can say it that way, people who don't avoid grief, who find themselves just pulled into the grief of other people who are hurting, nothing wrong with it. There's something, in fact, very right about it. That's the first thing we can learn about the tears of Jesus. That there's absolutely nothing wrong. There's no lack of information, no lack of spiritual maturity, there's no lack of faith. You're just sucked into all of it. But there is something else I think that we can learn. We have to do some work. We have to do some work. We have to do something in the world. Talking about volunteer work, to let our voices be heard. And there are all kinds of ways of doing that. I'm not going to go deeply into this, but you know what your voice is, and you know that it needs to be heard. But do we have to help the people that are displaced? You bet. Do we have to help those who are bereaved? You bet. Can we reach out to political systems that might need adjusting? You bet. So let's not be afraid of that. So that's what we learn from the tears of Jesus. Now the second thing we learn is how to deal with suffering. We learn from the anger of Jesus that, if you were listening carefully, that, these are pretty hard times. And did you notice anything in the text that indicated that Jesus was angry? You might remember it says he was greatly disturbed. Now, in some translations, right, we can take those words, greatly disturbed, and we can interpret them to be in a state of anger. In fact, one Greek translation will translate that into a state of rage, quaking with rage, strong rage. So let's see what we have here. Why is this relevant to us? Why is this anger important to us? Well, at first we have our shock, our weeping, and our grief. But as the day goes by, maybe that shock and grief become anger. We become angry at the situation, at the people involved, at the way the consciousness is expressing in humanity. But what does Jesus do with this as an example for us? What does Jesus do with his rage? He's filled with rage. He's not just tears, but he's filled with rage. But why? What does he do with it? Well, that's important. And there's at least two things that he doesn't do. One thing he doesn't do. And the first is that he's not actually like a Job's friend. You know what a Job's friend is? The story of Job in the Old Testament, right? Job was having a very terrible life. Right? His children died, he lost all his money, he became sick, he had all kind of challenges, right? And he had some friends that came and counseled him. And the friends said something like this. They walk in and said, well, clearly you're not living right because God must be judging you for your sins. These bad things wouldn't happen to you, Job, because God is judging you for your sins. Now that's what the friends say. But Jesus does not come in to Mary and Martha and is mad at them. He's not challenging them in their theology and their sins. He's not mad at the victims of this death. He's also not mad at the world. You know, this young man, Lazarus, who's been cut off in the prime of his life, he's not mad at that world either. The other thing that's interesting is that Jesus says to Martha, I am the resurrection and the life. And that's one of the things that are most stupendous claims. When Jesus says that, I am the resurrection and the life, it's one of the most stupendous claims that anyone ever made. And let's just remember what he's saying. Right? He does not say, look, I'm a healer. He says, I am the resurrection and the life. I am the author of life. Now we know when he's speaking in the I am, he's speaking from the full depth of spiritual awareness, the full oneness consciousness that we talk about in unity. So he's relating, when he says I am, he's talking about the oneness consciousness. I am is the resurrection and the life. He's saying that, you know, I'm not going to get mad at the victims here. I'm not mad at the weepers. You know, I'm not telling you to buck up, right? Upper chin, get your chin up. It's not saying what's the matter with you, don't you know? But he's not mad at any of those, not even at himself. So here's Jesus filled with rage. And he's one to be filled with rage, but not at himself, not for the others, not demonizing the victims, not demonizing anyone, including God. And maybe you're seeing the reason why I'm bringing this up today. When you consider some of our leaders and pundits. Everybody's talking publicly about this and that, and they seem to sure know a lot. And they put off the narrative structure to make sense of it. And you notice that you can't make sense of things unless the storyline has some important features. You can tell two storylines from this particular story. Our own particular stories that we have in the news today have their own storylines, but here's something. There's something wrong with the people involved. There's something wrong with God. So I'm suggesting today that we think biblically about this, that we use the example of Jesus to help us understand this. Because the Bible says God is love. Love your neighbor as yourself. Right? Put God above all things. So I remember way back in 2001 when the World Trade Towers fell, that I don't remember the guy's name, but I remember he was a Croatian. And he was speaking at the United Nations when the World Trade Towers came down. And I looked up what he said because I sort of remembered it, but here's what I found. He said, enormous poison comes into the world and in my life when I forget this. Problems happen when I exclude my enemy from the community of humans and when I exclude myself from the community of sinners. When I forget that my enemy is not a subhuman monster, but a human being. When I forget that I am not the perfect good, but also a flawed person. So Jesus is mad, angry, raging against death itself, against the tomb. He's mad at death. And here's what the storyline that Jesus is proposing. I'm going to turn this death into a resurrection. I'm going to bring out of this terrible situation something even greater that was there before. That is the storyline with spiritual understanding. And we all know this. Out of the cross comes the resurrection. Out of our weakness comes our real strength. Out of repentance and admitting that we're weak comes real power. And in giving way and serving others comes real strength. Out of generosity of giving our money comes real wealth. So that's the storyline. And our most effective leaders today, if you listen carefully, this is what they're saying. Right? We're not talking about being completely good, completely evil. They're saying that we can bring something even better out of the horrible things that are happening. That's what the best leaders are saying. They're saying that out of this loss and grief, something even better, out of death can come a resurrection. They may not use those words, but that's what's implied. We can be better people. We can be wiser and deeper. We can be a better country, a better world. So here's the point. Unless you learn how to handle your anger, unless you know that storyline to put on it, you will rail and rage against the politicians, against the perpetrators, against the inhuman monsters that we make people out to be. Or we're going to rail against God. How dare you let these awful things happen to good people? We'll rail against the demons that we perceive, and those demons begin to all look alike. Or we can adopt the storyline that out of death can come resurrection. Now, this is what the best leaders are saying. That's what I'm suggesting today. And this is also why Jesus used that storyline in this story. And so the advice to us today is, go ahead and feel your anger. But be angry about the dying, about the loss of the light, the dying of the light. And know that you're all about turning the light on, making it brighter. Now, somebody who's listening here could say, well, sounds like a pretty hard thing to do. First, you talk to me about tears, and you tell me that I need to be open, and I need to grieve with people, I need to be willing to cry and weep and connect with their ailing heart. Weep with those who weep, right? Yeah? And now you're telling me to really embrace my rage. Because if I don't, I might short-circuit the whole process. And you might say, well, I don't know if I can handle that. It sounds like different things. So then Jesus again gives us a third thing, very important thing. It's the ministry of truth. Not just tears, not just anger, but truth. When he speaks to Martha, he says, I am the resurrection and the life. Do you believe this? But you know what Jesus says, I can give you something much more. He's saying, if you want to get an even greater resource of what the ultimate way and power to handle this, there is only one kind of way through this. Not some altruistic thinking, not some Pollyanna belief, but he's asking Martha, do you believe in the power of transformation, of overcoming? Do you believe that? He says, I am the resurrection and the life. And again, when he's saying that, he's not talking just about himself, but he's embodying the full Christ consciousness. And he's inviting Mary into that. Do you believe that? He's inviting us into that. Do you believe that? Because unless you believe that our spiritual nature is the overcoming spirit in the world, we don't have access to this incredible thing that we're sharing here today. And Martha replies, yes, I do. So we're talking about having a vibrant connection with God and the Spirit. And with that wonderful experience of feeling the oneness in God, of seeing your life transformed through prayer and meditations, of knowing how your willingness to surrender, to let go, and to let God, just invite you to connect with that personal experience of knowing the God presence. Jesus does not say, look, if you trust in me, someday I'm going to take you away from all this. He's not saying that. Jesus came to say God can transform this situation here today and take it away. And if you believe in that consciousness, in that power of God in our life, then what's in front of us is some kind of wonderful state of being in which our mortal soul would just be able to forget about all this. He says, I am giving you resurrection. What is resurrection? Resurrection means I have come not to take you out of the earth and send you up to heaven. Resurrection is the power of establishing heaven on earth, to make a new heaven and a new earth, to make everything new. Again, do you believe this? The power of God has the power to restore what was lost and to make things better, to make them 1,000,000 times better. Imagine everything in our future, the powers of the new heaven, the new earth, when we really come into this awareness of that experience of having the Christ consciousness expressed in and through us. The wholeness of it will come, and with it will come health, and will come newness, and life, and vibrancy. And all the tears, and all the suffering, and all the death, and all the disease wiped out. The power of that is going to be incorporated and developed. Everything's going to be made better. Everything is going to be made right. I have a sort of a recurring nightmare that happens. It probably happens once a year or so. It's not really troublesome, but it happens. And what I dream is that I'm sleeping in my house and somebody breaks down the door and some people walk in and they're attacking us, they're wanting to kill us, they got guns and this sort of thing. Had that dream recently, that's why I'm aware of it. But lately, I almost like having that nightmare. You want to know why? Because after I wake up from that dream, there's something so unbelievably beautiful. You know, you give it a minute, maybe sometimes up to 5 minutes, you can feel it. You can say to yourself, wow, that was just a dream. It's a wake-up call, right? And you say, my gosh, it was a bad dream. Everything that I was living through is untrue. So what I like about waking up, even though the dream is terrible and the nightmare is terrible, that dream becomes untrue. It was a bad dream. And here we are in the new morning. It's just wonderful to be able to say, hey, it's a new morning. It was only a bad dream. And that's what Jesus is telling us, and that's what God is offering us. I am the resurrection and the life. God is offering us a nicer place. A place where things of the past can be a bad dream. God is saying, I'm not just going to give you consolation. I'm going to make it untrue, like a dream. I'm going to take all that difficult past, incorporate it, right? Harmonize it within you. And it's going to be integrated into the glory. Now, nobody says it better than Dostoevsky and the brothers Karamazov when he says the following. He says, I believe like a child that suffering will be healed and made up for, that all the humiliating absurdity of human contradictions will vanish like a pitiful mirage, that in the world's finale, at the moment of eternal harmony, something so precious will come to pass that it will suffice. It will comfort all resentments. It will atone for all the crimes, for all the blood that's been shed. I love that line. So precious will come to pass that it will suffice. That will make it not only possible to see something so precious, but it will make it possible to forgive, to justify everything that is happening right now. You might remember the movie The Lord of the Rings, where Sam the Hobbit, who at the very end of the movie, right, he thought everything was going wrong. But he wakes up and the sun is out. And he sees Gandalf, right? Gandalf, the great wizard. And he says to Gandalf, I thought you were dead. I thought I was dead. Is everything going to come untrue? And if we listen to the message today, the spiritual answer, the deepest spiritual answer is yes. Again, do you believe it? Because if you believe it, then you believe that there are a lot of people that are listening to this message, people of our community, who haven't really taken advantage of that in their life. And that's what I'm here to help you do today. All right, this is all about our spiritual work. This is all about what we do in our relationship with God. This is about how we show up to our prayer time, to our meditation, how we work on overcoming, what we do with our world, with our, how we show up, what kind of actions, what kind of vocabulary are we speaking. This will, C.S. Lewis also makes a point. He says, if I let God, God will make the filthiest of us into dazzling, radiant, immortal creatures, pulsating all through with such energy and joy and wisdom as love we cannot now imagine. He will make us into bright stainless mirrors which reflect back to God, perfectly though, of course, on a similar scale, His own boundless power and delight and goodness. That is what we're in for, and nothing less. Because if you believe this, as we're talking about, we can face these situations. Here's what's important. If we believe that, if we practice it in our life, we see the overcoming nature of spirit in our own life, then I think we can live more fully in this world. We can face anything with that. So, somebody may be listening to this and say, well, that sounds great. Sounds like a great deal. How do you know it's going to happen? How do I know? Well, I can say I believe it because I've seen it in my own life. I've seen transformation. I've seen overcoming. I've seen deep, hell-like situations in my life transformed into opportunities, profound lessons, openings. And, when we look at life from that point of view, everything becomes an opportunity for transformation. So, what Jesus has done here, He takes the tears and the truth, the anger, and at the very end, I don't know if you notice at the very end, Jesus addresses both Martha and Mary in very different ways. Same situation, same circumstances, same brother, right? And they actually both had the same question. Did you notice that? He says, hey, my brother wouldn't have died if you'd been here. Where were you? Right? They both asked him the same question. But when Martha asks the question, Jesus gives her not a rebuke, but comes at her with some pretty hard truth on the resurrection and the life. And in Mary's case, Jesus just wept with her. I want you to notice that. That's important. Because Jesus in this case is the perfect counselor. Right? Giving exactly what's needed. Martha needed to hear the truth. Sometimes we need somebody to call us on the truth. Right? To point that out to us. Sometimes it's hard to see. Sometimes we don't want to see it. But sometimes we need somebody to hold our feet to the truth. Have us work on it until it becomes a reality within us. And sometimes we just need to weep with somebody. And the only way to understand that is, again, through grace. We do our work. We come to meditation. We come to prayer. We come to oneness. We come with activity, our breathing, our yoga, all the things that we do. Our spiritual growth, our reading, our community, the way we speak, the emotions we feel, the way we allow God to work on those emotions, turn them over, see them elevated and transformed. And what is that if it isn't grace? So, God is the perfect counselor. Gives us exactly what we need when we need it. Maybe we need truth. Maybe we need somebody to cry with us. Whatever it is, it's perfect. And I think Jesus helps us in this example of Lazarus to understand that we can bring truth and tears and anger and most of all grace to the difficult situations of our life. God bless you all. I love each and every one of you. Bye-bye now.